Protein bars often feel like you're choosing between taste and nutrition. If it tastes good, you flip it over only to discover it's made with a whole paragraph of ingredients you've never heard of, or artificial sweeteners doing all the heavy lifting. It's basically just dessert in disguise. You shouldn't have to choose between tasty and nutritious. And that's what makes Aloha stand out. Aloha protein bars nail the delicious and nutritious. They're USDA organic and made with ingredients that actually grow somewhere. It's their whole taste that grows philosophy, literally. Plant-based ingredients grown in the ground, thoughtfully sourced and built to actually keep you satisfied. Their peanut butter cup bar has 14 grams of protein, 10 grams of fiber, and only 5 grams of sugar, which is wild considering how delicious it is. Made with no artificial ingredients or fillers, just something that tastes good and works the way it's supposed to. So if you're in the mood for something truly craveable and nutritious, try any of Aloha's protein bars. Grab one at your local grocery store or head to aloha.com.
Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back again for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the life of Arthur Adams. During the 1980s, Marvel had grown stagnant over the decades of innovating the comic book medium. After setting new standards of art and storytelling with creators like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko, the company had fallen on the very thing that hurt DC, resting on their laurels and believing that they were the standard in the comic book medium, especially their art, with John Romita Sr. and John Buscema setting the Marvel look. While brilliant artists in their own right, the company also forced their other artists to follow their standard, ending the innovation that led to Marvel's rise. As a result, DC, with works like The Dark Knight Returns and The Watchmen, started to break out in the 1980s and even surprised Marvel by surpassing them in sales. The artists at Marvel needed to break out, and their inspiration came from an artist in Arthur Art Adams in a miniseries many dismissed called Longshot, but ultimately, for better or for worse, changed the style of comic book art in the 1990s and beyond. Arthur Adams was born on April 5, 1963, in Holyoke, Massachusetts, the oldest of 5 brothers. His family moved around a lot due to his father being in the Air Force, going from Wisconsin to Philadelphia to West Virginia. His father was a loadmaster, meaning he had to make sure the cargo in airplanes was distributed evenly throughout so it wouldn't tip over or snap in half in flight, while his mother would work occasionally. Due to his father being in the Air Force, he was often away from the family up to a year at a time, thus his mother ended up being the disciplinarian. On a side note, Arthur Adams is no relation to fellow comic artist Neil Adams, though he sometimes gets confused when he signs just Adams at first, thus he started to sign his full name, Arthur Art Adams. When they would meet years later, Neil Adams jokingly calls him "my son" and gives him a big hug, making light of the confusion. Arthur Adams was fascinated by art from a young age. When he first saw stick figures his father drew on the moving boxes to represent the family. His father would encourage his art while his mother bought stacks of used comics for him and his brothers, which were often the 10-pound bundles wrapped in twine and included Marvel Comics Treasury editions, such as the works of Ross Andru, Jen Colan, and Wally Wood. Of his favorite characters in these comics, he enjoyed the Thing, the Hulk, and the Man-Thing. Despite this, Adams originally wanted to be a paleontologist because he loved drawing dinosaurs. Adams also loved superhero cartoons at the time, even if most of them were pretty bad, and was a huge Godzilla fan in relation to his love of dinosaurs. This grew the love of movie monsters in general, as they appeared in the creature features movies that ran on the Saturday morning TV, which included Frankenstein, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and King Kong. Of his favorite artists, Adams loved Michael Golden and the Micronauts, from which he imitated much of his highly detailed style, Walt Simonson's run on Thor and the Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans, which was another favorite, and the latter book he would call his Bible for comic books, especially how he told a clean story with multiple characters. Originally, Adams admits to dismissing Jack Kirby at first before becoming an artist and realizing the brilliance of his work. Adams also loved Barry Windsor Smith's run on the Conan the Barbarian and Frank Frazetta's paintings, which he would later try to imitate with watercolor. Adams later discovered Masamiya Shiro's Ghost in the Shell, which would lead to a strong influence of manga in his art as well. In high school, Arthur Adams was taught storytelling by his art teacher, Mrs. Kilgore, from the comic book strips, and stated that she judged him twice as hard as his fellow students as she recognized his talent. Originally, Kilgore wasn't too happy that Adams was interested in being a comic book artist, but when he brought her covers of Creepy, the horror magazine from Warren Publishing by Chandlerlin and Enrick, she realized it was actually well-done paintings. Adams and a fellow student even painted a mural on one of the school's walls, but it was since been painted over, which he's grateful for, as he thinks it was pretty bad in retrospect. However, at one point, Adams thought about acting over art, doing community theater, but dropped out at 19 as he finally started to focus on his art more. Plus, Adams admits he really started because there was a girl that was also acting that he liked. After high school, Arthur Adams worked at Round Table Pizza while avoiding to go to college, living in the San Francisco area. During this time, he was submitting his art to comic book companies in the hopes of getting a job. Adams was able to get a table at the creation convention because he knew Bob Schreck, who was in charge of the Artist Alley, and there Adams was able to make $20 a sketch, doing various pinups and customer requests. It was at these conventions he met his friend and future comic book creator of Hellboy, Mike Mignola, who was also looking to break into the comic book business. At these conventions, Joe Robenstein saw Adams' samples, who took them to Denny O'Neil at Marvel, who was currently doing the Bizarre Adventures series. O'Neil gave Adams a 3 to 4 page story, which Rubenstein inked. Unfortunately, the Bizarre Adventures comic would be canceled before his story was ever published, called The Return of Richard Besnick. Though Adams admits later that he wasn't happy with it, but it would still be over a year before he nearly got comic book work again. While waiting, he did contribute to the Way Off There and the Softly Winking Lights in 1984 Pacific Comics' three-dimensional alien worlds. Before this, Adams did unpaid work for the self-published High Energy #1 fanzine in the spring of 1982, which is why Adams calls that part that is not part of his professional career. The story was called One-Eyed Jack, which Adams called pretty bad, though it was his first published work. He also did a sketch published in DC's Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew, getting $10 for a Farrah Fawcett character sketch for Roy Thomas, which he based on the classic poster of actress Farrah Fawcett in the red swimsuit from Charlie's Angels. Finally, Arthur Adams' years of submissions paid off when Al Milgrom, who was leaving Marvel to go freelance, was cleaning out his desk and he noticed him. Milgrom showed him to editor Carl Potts before leaving, who was impressed, and he and his assistant, Ann Nocenti, sent Adams a 10 to 15-page script of the Defenders to do layouts for, which at the time included a team lineup of Angel, Beast, Iceman, Moondragon, and Gargoyle, for which he was paid $20 a page. However, Marvel wasn't completely impressed with Adams' art yet, as his action was stiff and his proportions were in the wrong places. Thankfully, he was about to have a chance to show what he could really do. Ann Nocenti had come up with a concept over the idea of a superhero with no memory of his past, along with the ability to manipulate luck in his favor. The story that formed was about Longshot, a slave in the Mojo-verse, where inhabitants are addicted to a gladiator-style TV show in which the ruler, Mojo, runs it, and Longshot is his biggest star. However, Longshot escapes his enslavement in the Mojo-verse on a quest to discover his past, which brings him to Earth and interacting with various Marvel superheroes from Spider-Man to Doctor Strange. Arthur Adams was given the task of penciling it, mainly because no one else wanted it. Adams gave Longshot a mullet hairstyle like the singer Lamiel in the Bang Kajagoogoo, while also having his costume be based on the Starfleet uniform from Star Trek The Motion Picture, with pouches for functionality. Adams never liked that heroes could just pull a device out of a skin-tight outfit. But also jokes the image artist who would later follow this up would go overboard with it. It was Ann Nocenti who came up with the idea of Longshot's left eye glowing with his luck powers activated, while to show that he was from another dimension, he was only given 3 fingers in each hand. The look of the character of Ricochet Rita, a human Longshot befriends on Earth, was based on Ann Nocenti, though he admits he is pretty terrible at drawing likenesses, thus she only kinda looks like her. As for the villain, Mojo, Nocenti's instructions were to create a disgusting monster, which is where his design came from. It took 2 years for Adams to complete this 6-issue miniseries, with the first issue alone taking 8 months, because Adams admits to being scared, this being his first major job. Louise Simonson was the original editor, though reportedly was pretty hands-off, thus the lengthy time period. While Elliot Brown and Marvel's editor-in-chief Jim Shooter helped Adams with storytelling, showing panel-to-panel structure from the old Marvel book. Adams would credit his past acting experience in helping create his characters, but admits the long time was also due to having to learn to draw things he never did before, such as windmills, babies, and people smiling. Also on the comic was Will Spataccio, who inked the comic and would be heavily influenced by Adams' style later on, as the rest of the image creators were, for better or for worse. Art Adams' friend Mike Mignola also helped inking on the last issue when Spataccio wasn't able to do it. Finally, in September of 1985, Longshot #1 debuted, and despite these delays, the comic was well received, though the first issue only sold 110,000 copies, at a time when 90,000 got you canceled. While many criticized the writing, Arthur Adams' art was singled out as the highlight of the series, introducing a dynamic style that immediately grabbed readers' attention, along with more than a few burgeoning artists again entering the field. Longshot was meant to be an ongoing series after issue number 6, which ended up being double-sized, according to Adams. And Nocente had written a script for the next issue along with a graphic novel, with plans to starting it up again in 1988. The idea of Longshot bouncing between dimensions each issue while battling with Mephisto, the version of the devil in the Marvel Universe. However, Adams immediately went to other projects, thus it faded away, while Nocente would make Mephisto the villain in Daredevil, which he was writing at the time. As for Longshot, the miniseries would have a permanent impact on the X-Men and Marvel books, as Longshot himself would join the X-Men in the X-Men Annuals number 10 in 1986, eventually marrying fellow X-Men the Dazzler, and being the parents of Shadowstar of the X-Force. Mojo World Mojo and his mortal-armed assistant, Spiral, would also become regular fixtures in the comics. Of course, it also launched Arthur Adams into the comic world. Nocente's position as the editor of the X-Books got Adams the attention of Chris Claremont, its main writer, which led to him penciling the New Mutant Special #1 and X-Men Annual #9 in 1986, for which Nocente was editor on both. Nocente also asked Adams to do the covers for Heroes for Hope, a 1985 book meant to raise money to battle famine in Africa, which had contributors from numerous creators, from Stephen King to Harlan Ellison. Chris Claremont wrote the New Mutant Special, which was the first time Adams worked with him, and was done by the Marvel method, i.e., Adams was given the plot first to draw from, with Claremont coming back afterwards to insert the dialogue. This all led to another significant moment in Arthur Adams' career when Nocente had him design a poster of Wolverine based on a cover of Uncanny X-Men number 173 by Paul Smith, featuring Wolverine in his brown and yellow costume with his claws out running towards the viewer. It soon became one of the most iconic images of the character, and this poster was everywhere, with Adams collecting an immense royalties from it, along with $1,000 up front, as it eventually was converted into a standee for comic book stores. This led to a lucrative avenue for Adams, as he did other posters for the New Mutants and the X-Men were also huge sellers, making $100 to $150 for 30 minutes of work, plus royalties and future sales. Adams also did the interior art for the 2-issue run on the X Factor and the one-shot Excalibur Mojo Mayhem in 1989, along with the X-Men Annuals in 1988 and 1990. It was here that Adams believed he was finally a professional artist and he felt confident in what he was doing. In these comics, another addition Adams helped make to the X universe was co-creating the X-Babies with Chris Claremont, essentially kids' versions of the X-Men. They were inspired when Mojo turned the X-Men into kids in the X-Men Annual number 10 in 1986, and then in Annual number 12 in 1988, Mojo, believing the X-Men were dead, had clones created because he missed his biggest ratings generator, only to get babies as a result. Mojo was about to kill them in response until he learned that the X-Babies got his highest ratings ever. Adams would return to penciling them in Excalibur Mojo Mayhem in 1989, where Kitty Pryde has a train ride interrupted when she has to rescue a group of X-Babies from Mojo. Adams started to show more of his manga influence here, as the inspiration for the X-Babies is in part from the Japanese comics making chibi, Japanese for little, style versions of their characters, which has been done in everything from the anime Attack on Titan to the American Ruby cartoon, both of which are highly recommended if you haven't watched them yet. It was during this time that, despite the demand for Arthur Adams due to his immense talent, he also developed a reputation for being late on books. Adams admits that part of this was whenever he had money in the bank, he got lazier, and it would only speed up when he started to go broke again. Adams did state he could, on average, do a page a day, thus he could do a regular monthly series if he wanted to, though he was often exhausted afterwards. As a result, Adams often found himself regularly at the covers, which he hated doing if he wasn't also doing the interior art, as he felt it was also called a form of false advertising. It didn't help that Adams rarely knew what the story was about when he did the covers, thus they rarely related to the story. In 1986, Arthur Adams did several pages in the landmark Batman number 400, with his look from The Dark Knight being heavily influenced by Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and did the Cloak and Dagger number 9 for Marvel, along with the covers for Appleseed, the English translation of the Japanese manga, which he painted. Next, he did X-Men Annuals number 12 to 14, but he hated that they were part of an ongoing story he wasn't a part of. He also didn't enjoy doing the Web of Spider-Man annual, mostly due to the editor he had to work with. While Arthur Adams was making himself a name at Marvel, he continued to find work at DC, penciling Action Annual number 1 with John Byrne in 1987, which he admits was another key moment in his career. Adams would use his art to vent some frustrations, as he depicted a female character being killed as looking like his ex-girlfriend, complete with her wearing the same Mr. Peanut t-shirt. He even used her as an excuse as to why his pages were late to Mike Carlin, the editor at DC he worked with, who only responded he didn't care and DC needed those pages. As mentioned earlier, Adams was heavily influenced by Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, especially looking for the characters, and thus his Superman had a huge chin like Miller's. When Carlin complained about it, Adams decided to just be a bit of a jerk and just made it bigger. However, Carlin and John Byrne would be frustrated with his storytelling, thus they would rearrange the panel layouts against Adams' objections. Dick Giordano did provide the inks, though, which Adams was thrilled by. In a surprising move, Arthur Adams' next project was the Gumby Summer Fun Special for Comico Comics. He was offered a job by Comico editor Dana Schultz, who noticed how he inserted Gumby into a long-shot miniseries, and liked the look he gave the character. Originally, Adams was afraid to take the job, as he think he would be typecast as the Gumby artist, so he told Comico he would do it if they got Bob Burden from the Flaming Carrot to write it. A half hour later, Adams got a call that Burden would write Gumby, thus he found himself drawing it. The timing actually worked out pretty well, as new cartoons of the character by creator Art Coakley were being created around the same time, and Adams would have noticed some strange crossovers. For example, when he depicted Gumby gritting his teeth in the comic, the cartoon would do the same. The Gumby Summer Special not only ended up being a huge success, but an acclaimed one as well, winning the Eisner for Best Single Issue in 1988, showing that Adams was just as adept as comedy as he was action. He would follow this up with the Gumby Winter Special with writer Stephen Purcell in 1989, and was featured in the Great Comic Book Artist Volume 2 by Ron Goulart, along with 54 other artists, with Adams providing the front and back covers. His next significant work was the new Fantastic Four story by writer Walt Simonson, which ran for three issues in Fantastic Four number 347 to 349 on December of 1989 to February of 1990, in which he had Ghost Rider, Spider-Man, the Hulk, and Wolverine team up when the original team is believed to be dead. Simonson came up with the idea because he liked replacing the Fantastic Four with Marvel's then top-selling heroes at the time. Originally, it was suggested to use the Punisher over the Hulk, but Adams preferred the Hulk, especially since he was currently in his Mr. Fix-It persona in the comic. The Punisher would make a cameo at the end of the story, while Adams would design Hulk toys for Marvel in the 1990s as well. Of course, his third issue was late in line with his growing reputation, but the series was a huge success, with the first issue selling 1 million copies, thanks to multiple printings and variant covers. Adams still considers this one of his favorite works, as the story also featured the alien race, the Skrulls, and the Mole Man and his numerous monsters, which gave Adams a chance to show off his ability to draw them to great effect, something he would put to use in his next job. Arthur Adams had become acquainted with Randall Stradley and the others at Dark Horse Comics, who originally tried to recruit him to work on their Aliens license. However, he didn't want to work on Aliens, but instead another property they had the license to, an old childhood favorite, Godzilla. In 1992, Arthur Adams penciled and wrote the Godzilla Color Special number 1 for Dark Horse, where he created the G-Force, a kind of Japanese version of Fantastic Four, who mentioned previously they fought this villain Screwmanoid, who would make an appearance in his later work. Toho, the movie studio that owned Godzilla, would later introduce a version of the team in the 1993 Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and a book of this making of the film featured a color illustration that was a copy of Adams' comic book, which he enjoyed. Adams would continue to do more Godzilla stories for Dark Horse, such as King Kong vs. Godzilla and Urban Legends number 1, notable for being the only story Adams wrote, penciled, inked, and lettered, and Trampoline Tokyo and Negative Burn number 18 on December of 1994, that was written by Alan Moore. In 1995, he penciled Godzilla vs. Hero Zero and wrote issues number 5 through 8 of the series Target Godzilla. Also at Dark Horse, when he learned that they acquired the rights to do the comic book adaptation of the classic Universal movie monsters, he lobbied to do an adaptation of the classic 1954 film The Creature from the Black Lagoon. He first wanted to do a sequel of the film, but Dark Horse asked Adams to first adapt the original, with the promise that if successful, a sequel would follow up later. Adams originally found the job tricky, as he found he couldn't find a script from the film, and he had to dig up an old videotape just for reference. Ironically, after he completed the comic, Adams later found the complete scripts and novelizations at the famous Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon. Great place if you're ever in the area. and joked that this was part of the curse that Walt Simonson once told him about, that whenever you needed a reference for your art, you could never find it. The 50-page adaptation of The Creature from the Black Lagoon was released in 1993, and despite the comic being well received, it lost money initially. Thus, Dark Horse had to cancel the entire Universal Monster line, including Adams' proposed sequel. Despite this, Arthur Adams developed a strong relationship with Dark Horse Comics, to the point that when Eric Larson approached him and Mike Mignola to join Image Comics, they both turned him down. It did spur Adams to finally make a try at creating their own work, dusting off an idea he originally called Angel and the Ape, though he went to change the name as that was a comic by DC published back in 1968 created by E. Nelson Bridewell about a female detective and her simian partner. His idea would actually be similar in concept, now called Monkey Man and O'Brien, about the daughter of a missing scientist, Anne Darrow O'Brien, whose experiments teleported a superintelligent ape, Axwell Tiberius, the titular Monkey Man, to Earth from another dimension, while also causing Anne O'Brien to grow to 7 feet tall with superhuman strength. The two then engaged in numerous adventures together, including taking on the previously mentioned Scrumanoid from his run on Godzilla. This was part of the larger Legend imprint by Dark Horse that they created in reaction to Image Comics, allowing creator-owned works, and would include Mike Mignola with his Hellboy, Frank Miller's Sin City, John Byrne's Next Men, Paul Chadwick, Jeff Darrow, Mike Alfred, and Dave Gibbons. Monkey Man and O'Brien first appeared in the San Diego Comic Con Comics number 2 in 1993, and then Dark Horse Presents number 80 that same year. And then later Dark Horse Insider number 27 in 1994. Next, Monkey Man and O'Brien would have finally appeared under the Legend imprint as the backup feature in Mike Mignola's Hellboy, Seed of Destruction, the first comic book for the character, miniseries in 1994, eventually getting its own miniseries in 1996. Adams had plotted up of the 24 issues, but he never got around to finishing it, as Adams started to get other little jobs here and there, like the crossover with Gen 13 and Image, and appearing in Savage Dragon in number 41 in September 1997, finally working with Image Comics and Eric Larson. Adams would even do a Gen 13 Generation X cover for the crossover between Image and Marvel Comics. While Monkey Man and O'Brien has been officially defunct since then, along with Legend, which ended in 1998, Adams admits if he wanted to start up the comic book again, Dark Horse would be game, but he just found himself doing other work. Arthur Adams would later work at America's Best Comics, ABC, with Alan Moore and Tom Strong, number 4, and Joni Future in 1999. The latter book was a futuristic series Adams co-created with writer Steve Moore, meant to be a mix of Adam Strange and Barbarella, about Joni Future, who after inheriting her uncle's house upon his death, learns he was an interdimensional defender and takes up his mantle. The series appeared in an 8-page installment in Tom Strong's Terrific Tales, with her first appearance being in issue number 1, with Adams penciling the first 10 issues for 2002 to 2004. Adams admits to a stronger romantic influence in designing the character from being a mix of Vampirella and the Capcom characters, video game characters. To date, Arthur Adams considers Joni Future his best artistic work. Adams also did 2 issues of The Authority at Wildstorm in 2002, which DC requested he redraw to de-emphasize the violence after 9/11, to something to Adams' frustration. In addition, he got to work on The Rocketeer with Dave Stevens at Comic Go. To date, Arthur Adams mostly works as a cover artist while providing private commissions for freelance work, such as the covers of PlayStation Magazine, or providing designs for polyresin busts of female characters for Dynamite Entertainment, which also includes Red Sonja and Vampirella. When asked if he ever intends to return to interior art, Adams states it would be for a revival of Monkey Man and O'Brien. Adams says he tries to get to his drawing table at 9 in the morning and work through to 5, and he believes he has bad layout skills, thus he tries to hide them with lots of characters. He does try to leave space for word balloons, especially with complete scripts. Adams admits that his tight penciling keeps his process longer, thus preventing him from doing a regular series, and only able to work on the covers or miniseries. Most recently, Marvel published the Marvel monograph, The Art of Arthur Adams, X-Men, a 120-page collection of his work at Marvel. In his personal life, Arthur Adams is married to Joyce Chen, a fellow comic book artist known best for her covers at Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and so forth, whom he met at the 1996 San Diego Comic-Con, and they have both since settled in Walnut Creek, California. The two have even worked together, inking each other's pencils at times. As for his legacy, Arthur Adams still remains an accomplished and in-demand artist, and he could arguably be the chief influencer of today's artistic style, in which the highly detailed art that Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and later Joe Madureira displayed. While it's been pointed out that Michael Golden, who influenced Adams, did it earlier, it was Adams who made him popular with his dynamic poses, reflective surfaces, and costumes with numerous accessories. Thus leading to, for better or for worse, the art style that set the Image comic books in the 1990s that was later copied industry-wide. While Adams himself never went so far as they did, as his work on Gumby and Godzilla showed, he did represent a significant shift in the comic book style in the 1980s and 90s, thus ensuring his place in comic book history. I would like to thank the chief source for this episode, Modern Masters Volume 6, Arthur Adams, by George Corey and Eric Nolan Wivington, which features a great interview of Arthur Adams along with some nice reprints of his art. A solid read for any comic book history fan.
And now is April 23rd, 2026, time for the favorite comic of the week. Headlopper by Andrew MacLean, which is as a semi-annual return to the series. That is a great refresher. It comes in a nice giant-sized comic. It's like 85 pages. That basically features the adventures of Headlopper, the fantasy satire series that finds the titular Headlopper and his friends going on another adventure where he naturally is lopping off heads. Andrew MacLean has a lot of fun with this series. Like, it's very much a fantasy satire where it's a very simple present, but he adds some great mythology to it. Like I said, it's a great catch-up for new readers because he actually goes back to the mythology of the world that Headlopper takes place in. And his art is very nice and cartoony and simple, basically making the very violent, headlopping very fun to watch. So, yeah, great original series, one of the better fantasy series on the stands, and just a great read in general. And with that, I want to first off apologize for this last bit of the quality because I'm recording this from my hotel room in D.C. I'm taking some vacation time, but heading to museums. And one of the things I love about coming to D.C. is, well, there are so many great ties into the comic book history down here. Like, I went to the American History Museum, and they had features about Captain America's shield, and Storm's costume was on display from the X-Men movies. They also had some trades of the classic Marvel comic books on sale. The Spy Museum reminded you that Jack Kirby actually provided artwork for the film, for the Argo Canadian caper, where they made a fake film to sneak people out of Iran. And a lot of great stuff. William Moulton Marsden's lie detector was on display to point out the fact he also created Wonder Woman. A lot of very cool stuff. A lot of great stuff. So you can find comics everywhere. It's so permeated in American culture. It's just great to see. But with that, we'll conclude this episode of The Archives. Join me again next week for likely another episode. And until then, go and enjoy yourself a good comic book. And definitely check out Headlopper. The new issue's out. It's a great refresher for people who haven't gotten the series yet.